مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. تواجه أمريكا مجددا تهديدا من جانب الإرهاب، ويتجادل الأمريكيون مجددا حول الاستراتيجية الصائبة لمواجهة هذه المشكلة. ما مدى خطورة التهديد من جانب داعش؟ هل يهدد دولتنا ومجتمعنا وحضارتنا أم أنها مجرد مشكلة إقليمية محدودة لا تؤثر على أمريكا إلا قليلا؟ ماذا ستستلزم هزيمة داعش؟ قوات جوية؟ طائرات دون طيار؟ قوات عربية محلية؟ أم الجيش الأمريكي؟ هل داعش جماعة إرهابية أم أن داعش شيء آخر؟ دولة بكل الخصائص السياسية والمؤسسية والمالية والعسكرية للدولة ذات سيادة. هذه الأسئلة تدور في قلب حوارنا الوطني بين الجمهوريين والديمقراطيين ووسط دوائر الجمهوريين والديمقراطيين كذلك، لاستجلاء دقائق استراتيجية قتال تنظيم داعش وهزيمته. يسرني أن أرحب باثنين من الخبراء البارزين في شؤون السياسة الولايات المتحدة لمكافحة الإرهاب، نظرة وهاورد جامبريل كلارك. Welcome back to Dakhil, Washington. America is now involved in the fight against Daesh, the Islamic State, ISIS, ISIL, whatever you call it, it is an adversary. But it's different than most of the adversaries we've had before, and I'm delighted to welcome Howard Gambriel Clark and Juan Zarate to talk about what makes this adversary unique. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So how would you classify Daesh? We'll use that term for our Middle Eastern guests. How would you classify Daesh? Is this a terrorist group, a rogue state, something in between, Howard?
I'd say all of the above. I think certainly we have, it's a brand name, much as Al-Qaeda is. It's really the newest iteration, the sort of the child of Al-Qaeda. And that is that it continues to portray or to give off this unassailable narrative of Muslims under attack, to try to inspire foreign fighters throughout the world, to try to inspire new states, whether it's areas in northern Egypt or areas in northern Libya. At the same time, there is state apparatus, but it's not the way we think of state apparatus. In other words, their headquarter buildings, their bureaucracies, they're run much like Hamas, and that is in the basements of mosques, in the basements of schools, in the basements of hospitals, not easily gotten to by drone strikes or direct attacks.
So, state apparatus, this doesn't sound like your grandfather's terrorist group.
No, it's a group born out of terrorism, of course, born out of the chaos in Syria, born from the vestiges of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and what came in Iraq later in terms of sectarian tension. But Howard's right, it's a different beast. It now controls territory. It has literally erased borders between Syria and Iraq. It has pronounced itself as the caliphate, which has ideological dimensions for the jihadi movement around the world, and has also developed a new form of financing, has certainly access to external investment from those who are supporting it, but has run a war economy unlike anything we've seen to date, with the oil revenues, with extortion rackets, with kidnap for ransom industry, even extraction of antiquities. And so Daesh is really a terrorist group, but it's a state, the way Howard described it, but it's adapted. It has developed a new form of governance, a new form of running an economy, and has really animated a new form of the ideology by pronouncing the caliphate.
So let me just ask you very quickly, you referred a moment ago to the finances, an area that you know something about. What would you put as a round figure to an annual budget of Daesh?
Well, the estimates out there are wildly divergent, and I don't think anyone knows for sure. But you have estimates for the oil revenue, $1 million a week in some estimates. The revenue from extortion at about $8 million a month. Kidnap for ransom, there's a new estimate out, $45 million a year. And so the estimates are out there very widely. I don't think anyone really knows. One estimate that's been put out there is that the Iraqi government has had to expend about $2 billion a year to run that part of Iraq that Daesh now controls. I think that's a false marker because I'm not quite sure that they're having to expend the way that the Iraqi government did or that the Iraqi government actually expended that amount. But in any event, it's in the tens of millions of dollars at least, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And that's why American officials at least have said it's the best resource terrorist organization in modern history.
Okay. Howard, let me ask you about recruitment strategy. How are they getting their people?
I think that's really where the center, or one of their centers of gravity lies. And ultimately it comes down to, again, this narrative. They've stolen al-Qaeda's narrative of Islam is under attack. Every time there's a drone strike, even if it just targets a terrorist groups, terrorist organizations, terrorist cells, they're able to paint that as, again, an attack against Islam, an attack against brother Muslims. And so you have thousands from Europe, you have hundreds from the United States and Canada as well coming over there. And they've been able to inspire lone wolf attacks, whether you look at the attack in Brussels last spring, the failed attack in Australia, of course the 2 attacks in Ottawa, the hatchet attack here in New York City, likely was slightly inspired by Islamic State, Daesh, as well as al-Qaeda and other groups. And so, again, it's really this narrative that is at the heart of the recruitment. But on top of that, they have really great media, and they really own the information space, not only in the region, but also throughout the world, using Twitter, using Facebook, using YouTube. We've seen this before with al-Qaeda. It's just they've gotten very good, much better at it, in my opinion. I think their magazine, Dabiq, is slightly snazzier, if you will, than, let's say, Inspire by al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. In addition, some of their videos that have come out have been so good, have really looked like a sort of a US action movie that people in the United States, they no longer have to go to these terrorist websites to become inspired. You can go to CNN.com or bbc.co.uk and you can watch these recruitment videos right on these mainstream media sites.
So they're getting mainstream media to project their image for them.
They are, because of their excellence in media, yes.
And go ahead.
Actually, I was going to say, I think it's the retweets of their tweets that actually have more impact and reach, and you have mainstream media doing exactly that. I think one of the other interesting factors in their recruitment and their personnel is they've taken advantage of the environment. There's so much animosity toward the Assad regime in a sense that the prior efforts to dislodge Assad have not been helpful, so ISIS has been able to recruit around the fight against Assad. They've also been able to recruit within Iraq around the sectarian tension. So on the Sunni side, they've been able to pull some of the Ba'athist forces into their war machine and war strategy. That's been helpful. And certainly they've been able to use force and intimidation to force enlistment into their forces. So in addition to all the external recruits that have come in, and we're talking about thousands of foreign fighters into the environment, they've also been able to take advantage of the local environment to strengthen and diversify their base.
So just in terms of some of the basic numbers, approximately how many people do we think are hardcore, what we would call card-carrying members of Daesh, and what's the breakdown between just Syrians and Iraqis, sort of narrow locals, versus all the foreigners?
Well, if you don't include some of the tribal groups that have temporarily allied themselves with Islamic State, as you were saying, for some political leverage against Baghdad, for example in Iraq, as well as some groups in Syria, meaning tribal groups, clan groups in Syria and Iraq, who have sided with Islamic State, not because they're, have whole-scale radicalized, but they see these guys as being the biggest, baddest guy on the block. In other words, they can bring this long-term stability and security that they need. And this is done, this sort of loyalty is done in return for autonomy. If you take them out of the picture, we're looking at about 15,000 foreign fighters today. And so to include those 15,000 fighters, or if you include those 15,000 fighters, overall we have between 20 and 31,500 members. And that's in Syria and Iraq.
The numbers get fuzzy, though, because I think it's not clear that all the foreign fighters are going and fighting for ISIS. Some are going to fight for al-Nusra, the al-Nusra front. Some fall into other camps and groups. But Howard's exactly right. The numbers are in that range. And when American counterterrorism officials talk about this, they're very worried that in some ways they've underestimated the numbers of fighters that they estimate are part of the Daesh network.
You mentioned America. How central is America to the ideology and the operations of Daesh? I mean, we Americans all got very enervated and angry and activated at the executions. But how central is this tactic to what Daesh is trying to accomplish? Juan?
I don't think it's a matter of centrality or peripheral themes. I think it's part of the broader narrative and the movement that Daesh is a part of. In some ways, they've piggybacked off of the al-Qaeda narrative and the movement that has been so accelerated post 9/11. And part of that narrative is the notion still of the United States as being the head of the snake, the part of the global movement that has to be confronted. And in some ways, Daesh represents this, this new hybrid, both ideology and movement, where it's both a local insurgency and has local and regional goals and is trying to govern, but also still has embedded that global jihadi DNA, that narrative that still has a focus toward the West. And I think that's what's dangerous here. You have this admixture of the local goals with the attempts to attack globally. And I think that's what has Western officials so worried, especially with the inflow and outflow of foreign fighters. Okay,
when we come back after the break, we're going to complete our diagnosis of the problem and talk about what we should be doing about it in just a moment. Our panelists include Juan Zarate. Juan, who you know as a regular panelist here on Dakhil, Washington, is a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies and the senior national security consultant and analyst for CBS News. One of our nation's leading counterterrorism and national security experts, he served in the administration of President George W. Bush as assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor. Sitting to his right is Howard Gambrill Clark, the president of the Stability Institute, associate fellow at the International Center for the Study of Radicalization, and the founder and president of Seventh Pillar Incorporated. A U.S. Marine veteran with multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, he served in the Department of Homeland Security as senior intelligence analyst for counter-radicalization, responsible for intelligence support in the battle against violent extremism. While earning his doctorate from King's College London, he served as senior counter-violent extremism advisor and trainer for numerous U.S., foreign, and international agencies, including the Department of State, NATO, and partner governments in Southwest Asia. His publications include 2 critically acclaimed books titled Kill Al-Qaeda and Revolt Against Al-Qaeda. Well, that sounds like a good place to begin.
Let's do that, both.
Actually, I have one more sort of analytical question. Let me start with you, Howard.
Yeah.
You referred earlier in your comments to places around the Middle East where Daesh is active, and it's part of what some people call their archipelago strategy. What does that mean?
Well, one of the narratives that they have is to reclaim this caliphate, something like what the Ottoman Empire was, like what the Abbasid Empire was. And that is reaching from Spain all the way to Afghanistan, even up to areas in China. And so what they've done is they've inspired one particular town in Libya, they've inspired a group in Egypt, they've inspired individuals throughout India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and this continues to be one of their periphery efforts.
And do they actually have control in those territories around the Middle East and beyond?
In Libya. There's one town in Libya where the Islamic State has control, and that's it.
Juan, when you look at traditional counterterrorism strategies, what will work and what won't work against Daesh?
Well, I think the conventional efforts to constrict their reach and capacity, affecting the external dimensions of their capabilities, can still be applied here. Things like cutting off financing from the outside, slowing the flow of foreign fighters in and out of the territory, disrupting plots that may be coming out of the center of this group. The challenge, though, is this is a group that has a foothold in a broad swath in the heart of the Middle East. And that then resorts to the questions of how do you dislodge a group like this? How do you engage perhaps in counterinsurgency? And importantly, how do you ensure that these ink blots of support that you were just talking to Howard about don't expand? And so that has an ideological dimension to it, where there has to be an undermining of their credibility and legitimacy. But there's a physical dimension, which is they have to be dislodged from the areas that they control, places like Fallujah and ultimately Mosul and Raqqa. And so that really presents some challenges, of course, for any coalition, including the one led by the U.S. from the air, to try to dislodge this group.
Howard, what do you think?
Well, we certainly have a top-down strategy, and it's a similar top-down strategy we've been implementing since 2001. And again, I would say, in my estimation, it has failed. It continues to fail. Every time we conduct a drone strike, every time we conduct a direct strike by U.S. or regional allies in Iraq or in Syria, it plays right into their narrative, and they're able to recruit more and more people.
So President Obama has defined America's objective as to degrade and ultimately defeat. I believe that those are his words. Degrade and ultimately defeat. Is that the right objective?
In my opinion, the right objective is not, I think we should focus less on degrade, because we've been doing a great job of degrading Al-Qaeda and like organizations over the last 13 years. Yet in the last 5 years, arguably, of course, according to Peter Bergen, the breadth and the coverage of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, and ISIS has spread twofold. So we should be focused on absolute defeat.
So less degrade and more defeat.
And 07, that's right, yeah.
One?
I think in the first instance, it's about containment and degrading. I do think you have to shrink their area of control. You've got to shrink their attractiveness. You've got to contain any globalization of their effort, of the type that Howard was describing. But I think in the minds of the administration, the defeat element is sort of a natural end state as to how you would discuss this, because you can't have a policy that says, oh, we're going to let this group survive. There's an accommodation to be made. That's not possible from a political perspective. But in the minds of American officials, that's a very long-term effort.
You don't think defeat is really an operational plan?
Certainly not in the short term. And if we were serious about that, we would be applying much more pressure. We'd be getting arms on the ground, and we'd be much more definitive about what we're doing.
Well, this was going to be my next question is, even if you take the president's objective, to what extent are our means connected to our ends?
Currently what we're doing, not whatsoever. I think that certainly there are efforts to contain, as Juan was saying, certainly cutting off the number of foreign fighters that come over the border with Turkey by working with Turkish officials, police, the border guards, and their government in Ankara, by trying to turn off the money they're making from oil, for example, so that entities within Turkey aren't able to buy them, and other entities throughout the region as well. Certainly these are things that, sure, it's good to do, but at the same time, we have to understand, we have to look to other models of what's worked over the last 13 years, areas that are free of violent extremism. And we have to understand, if the president's end state in counterterrorism, whatever area of operations we're talking about, if it's to deny areas violent extremist influence and presence, then it begins and it ends with the people. Unless we want to have eternal troops, whether it's regional, local, international troops in an area, unless we want to have an eternal security operation, ultimately it becomes empowering resilient communities to fight off the influences and also the presence and incursion of violent extremists. And so while it's important to degrade, it's important to have a holistic effort, it's important to go after the finances, it's important to go after the network. In addition to that, we have to focus, I think, first and last, keeping these people out of the areas eternally.
Okay. Juan, what would you be doing that we're not doing?
Well, I think we would need to be, and would have to be, much more aggressive on the ground. That doesn't mean more the U.S. and our coalition forces. That doesn't mean more combat troops necessarily, but it does mean a much more aggressive approach to supporting the Peshmerga, a much more aggressive approach to supporting the tribes in Anbar in particular that are currently fighting or attempting to fight Daesh, and a more aggressive approach on the Syrian side of the border. One of the disconnects you've seen in American policy is this attempt to segment the campaign against Daesh, to say, we're going to try to set things right in Iraq, contain and defeat them perhaps there first, and then move to Syria. You just can't bifurcate the strategy that way. The reality is they've erased the border, they're operating in both, They've taken full advantage of the chaos and the opportunities in Syria. And to not have clarity and an aggressive strategy on the ground in Syria in addition to Iraq is just allowing them more breathing space, more opportunity to adapt. And I think with that time, you give them also an opportunity to inspire and adapt globally. And I think that's the real danger here. And I think if I were back in my old position, I would be advocating for a much more aggressive approach on the ground through proxies to fight head on where Daesh was pressuring the local population, to create that resilience and to create the opportunity to really begin to constrict them, both in Iraq and Syria.
Sounds like you're both urging connecting ends and means, something which neither of you seems to think is happening right now.
It's not happening.
It's not happening.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us on Dakhil, Washington.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول نجاح سياسة الولايات المتحدة ضد التطرف الإسلامي، أرجو أن تتصلوا بي مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.